Good evening, folks, and welcome tonight to Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary here on campus and everyone else online. And for folks who are new in this space, this is the first time we've used this new setup. But for everyone who's here, if you look back, if it's got a red light on it, that's the camera we're looking at, I was told. So thank you all for making the time to be here. I'm going to open us with prayer, give an introduction to the lecture series, and then we will send it over to Dr. Presler Lecture to do our introduction of our speaker and get us set for the night. Let us pray. Gracious and almighty God, we are thankful for the opportunity to gather to be inspired, to be supported, to be comforted, and to be challenged. We gather this evening then as folks who are connected through our seminary, through our town, through our desire for something better and for hope, for peace, for wondering about what it looks like to continue to live in our nation at this time, and to wonder what theologically we are called to reflect upon. Therefore, we are thankful to have this place to be, and we ask that you guide us in our conversation tonight and truly help us to hear what you would have us hear. Through your Spirit, we pray. Amen. And welcome officially to the Reverend Dr. Henry and Marian Anders Presler Lecture Series. Henry attended LPTS for 2 years before transferring to Boston University's School of Theology, and the Preslers established the lecture series in 1992. The Henry H. and Marian A. Presler Lectureship was established to honor the couple's missionary service and to inspire the Louisville Seminary community and its wider lifelong learning community about issues of global mission and the role of American denominations in the historical and present witness mission. The topics of the lectures will vary each year with lectures chosen, but the theme shall always be Jesus Christ's commission to the church in Matthew 28, 19 through 20. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. We take this missionary call and we reflect upon what it means right now, in this place and in this time. And as we think back historically, what this has meant to us, what will we do with it as we go forward? I'm delighted to welcome and introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Presler Lecture, the director of our Black Church Studies program here at Louisville Seminary and associate professor of practical theology. Dr. Lecture.
Grace and peace, and good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to introduce our lecturer for this evening. Scripture says how good and pleasant it is when we all gather and dwell together. It's important to gather and dwell together for moments of educational empowerment as well. Dr. Bryson White, our lecturer for the evening, is the father of Kairos Gay White, husband to Jennifer White, and son of Paul and Sheila White of Fresno, California. Dr. White is an assistant professor at Santa Clara University in the Religious Studies Department. Prior to his work in the academy, Dr. White was a faith-based community organizer, working on areas such as violence reduction and faith formation in his hometown of Fresno, California. Dr. White received his BA in political science from California State University in Northridge and master's degrees in intercultural studies and theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. He received his PhD from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in 2022. Dr. White conducts research in areas of theology, Black studies, carceral studies, visual studies, critical geography, and Tupac Shakur. Dr. White's current research focuses upon the intersections between Christian eschatology and race, with particular emphasis upon Christian eschatology's influence upon the creation and maintenance of the carceral state. His scholarship has been generously funded by the Forum for Theological Exploration and here locally by Louisville Institute. And he has served as a research assistant for the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Dr. White is currently working on a manuscript that explores the Christian eschatological dimensions of mass incarceration on Black people in these United States. At this time, let us welcome Dr. White.
All right, thank you so much. It's so good to be with you all, Louisville, and for those who are attending online. What's up, Mom? My mama's online watching, and my siblings and my wife. My son, Kairos, who's 4, he's probably not watching. But today, I'm excited to talk to you about Christian eschatology and Black disappearance. And the title of it is Birth of a Nation, Christian Eschatology and Black Disappearance. We're going to think about the 1915 film by D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, which set sort of the foundations for American race in the 20th century. But I want to begin just by sharing a bit of my story as to how I came to the topic of eschatology as research. So in 1995, I was 12 years old, and I was a 7th grader at Tenaya Middle School in Fresno, California. The 7th grade was a difficult year for me as I transitioned from my elementary school enclave, where I found much success, into a new environment where I had to find my way. During this season, my brother was incarcerated, and there were not enough therapeutic mechanisms in place for me to process the impact of what seemed to be his sudden disappearance on the life of me and my older brother, Brandon. The combination of the transition from elementary school to middle school and my brother's incarceration caused my grades to slip for the first time in my young life. When my father began to intervene because my teachers were calling home and telling my parents I was not doing my homework, he shared concern with me about my lack of motivation. He also began to share his concerns with me about my newfound love for dispensationalism and my obsession about the rapture. In 1995 was also the same year I began to watch the Trinity Broadcasting Network in earnest. I paid special attention to the preachers who were convinced of the imminent return of Jesus and the sudden disappearance of his faithful followers. I listened intently to John Hagee and Jack Van Impe and believed that they were exactly right, that Jesus' return could be at any moment. That same year, Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins published the first of 16 books in their famous, and I would say infamous, Left Behind series. I devoured the first book, Left Behind, a novel of the Earth's last days. I told everyone that I could that the end was near, but most members of my family believed it in some form or fashion. Right? It was the eschatological air that we all breathed, not knowing that there were other interpretations within the Christian tradition of the last days. Comically, our security code on the alarm house was actually rapture. I said it too, I set that code. And it's no longer the case in case you're trying to break into my house. We changed that a long time ago. One day when my father was driving me to school, he told me, Bryson, just because you believe that Jesus is coming back does not mean that you don't have to do your homework. And I was genuinely perplexed in my young mind. I thought schooling didn't matter considering my recently found facts. But I think my dad was sensing other issues that were lying under the surface, and that my newfound zeal about the rapture was a way of dealing with the anxieties of transitioning into middle school, and perhaps as a way of dealing with the carceral disappearance of my brother. The rapture as a belief system gave me tools, potentially short-sighted ones, to interpret my life within a larger world. I didn't abandon my belief in the rapture through my conversations with my father. That kind of came later in my theological journey during college, but it did sow a lesson into my young spirit that I draw upon even to this day, not to use my theology for the purposes of avoiding the responsibilities that I have in the world. Lessons from my father settle deep into my spirit and inspires my research on the influences of Christian eschatology and Black disappearance into carceral spaces. And today, I want to think about how Christian eschatology informs ideas of Black disappearance as articulated by the white supremacist film, The Birth of a Nation. I want to think about the prison. I also want to think about the prison as an eschatological space where this disappearance of Black persons is made manifest. Furthermore, I want to offer a reading of the rapture as an extension of birth's idea of Black disappearance as a solution to social crises. as the rapture sedimentation in American society takes place in somewhat of a mutually enforcing relationship with the emergence of the Black mass prison. So I'm trying to do a lot, so if I do too much, right? But first, just a little bit about the film Birth of a Nation. Just out of curiosity, how many people have seen Birth of a Nation? People kind of like, I don't wish that I've seen it, but you've seen it, yeah. I mean, it's an important film to watch, right? We're actually going to watch a portion of it down the line here in a little bit, because I do think it's important for us to see. But a bit about the film. D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, Birth of a Nation, served as the launching point of what would become modern American cinema. Griffith and his co-producer, Thomas Dixon Jr., cast a vision through the film's racist rewriting of U.S. history for the purposes of using the medium of film to reinforce a society predicated upon white supremacy. The impact of Birth was so potent that it led to the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan as they took their cue and call to arms to reinforce Anglo-Protestant dominance in the United States, particularly in the South and in the Midwest. The film articulates this social vision in part in the form of an eschatological hope, one where the return of Christ comes only after all Black persons are disappeared from the nation. Images of eschatological disappearance that I want to offer come to inform U.S. life. The context of the film's massive success was the 50th anniversary of the Civil War, as the lost cause narrative pervaded the South. World War I, the subsequent wave of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and the taunting of the Black heavyweight boxing champion and lover of Anglo women, Jack Johnson. The film functioned as a midwife of a new masculine American whiteness, one that denied the historical facts of the nation pertaining to the vileness of slavery. Furthermore, the emergence of Birth was accompanied by the racial settlement of segregation in the southern part of the United States through Jim Crow law and culture and financial and industrial transformations in the U.S. economy and ways of life. As an artistic and theological articulation of white supremacy, the racial portraiture of Black people in Birth are of bloodthirsty insurgents who are constant threats to the purity of white women, or depicted as docile Sambos and Mammies who enjoyed life under the regime of white supremacy. Birth was not a film that existed at the margins of American society. Not only was it massively successful, but its racial vision was endorsed by then President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, former New Orleans Klansman and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward White, and several members of the House of Representatives and U.S. Senate as they viewed the film in the East Room of the White House. Famously, President Woodrow Wilson so enthralled by the film that he declared it was like history written in lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true. I want to let that land on you all a little bit, that it was the President of the United States, the Chief Justice of Supreme Court, who was also a former Klansman, and several members of the House of Representatives and U.S. Senate viewed this film in the White House at the highest space of power in the land. But now I want to show the brief piece of Birth of a Nation. It's about 3 or 4 minutes or so, and it's going to show the eschatology that we're going to explore today. This is at the very end of the film. I guess that's why I'm here to tell you what I think about it, right? Yeah. But what stood out to you? Out of curiosity, if there's any volunteers.
There's a certain imprimatur that they call it. It's like Jesus appears, so they call that somewhere in there. And so that gives the stamp of approval on the fact that everything that went wrong with the world is no longer wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Let me get one more. This is what I tell my students when I teach. Let me get one more in my class.
I saw the city on the hill.
You saw the city on the hill, right? Yeah. So they watch as the city on the hill descends from heaven, right? Right. So at the conclusion of birth, right, and after the Ku Klux Klan has rooted out all Black empowerment through defeating Reconstruction, that's what we see as the Klan is kicking Black folks out of the South in that early scene. There, we see a man stand on a steed, swinging a sword, and he's killing. And half of the masses are reaching out to him, while the other half lay dead and slaughtered. As the man sits on the steed, the clamoring and slaughtered masses phase out of the picture and are replaced by a great gathering of Anglos wearing togas, dancing, smiling, and they're very happy. As we attend to this concluding scene, what I want to offer, what emerges is a Christian eschatology rooted in the eternal celebration of whiteness and the eternal celebration of Black removal through drawing upon the Christian eschatological symbol of the great banquet from the book of Revelation. In birth, Jesus himself blesses the banquet and the complete removal of Black presence from its midst. What birth is suggesting is that the removal of Black life from American social life is rooted within a Christian eschatological vision that places white supremacy at the center of God's ultimate concern. By rooting this concern eschatologically, birth is making a claim that this is how contemporary U.S. life should look, Black people being absent from public life, a project that can only be accomplished through violent force. The final shot of the film depicts the symbolic reconciliation between the North and the South, which has been provided through the religio-racial terror of the Ku Klux Klan and the return of Anglo-Jesus. Ben Cameron and Elsie Stoneman are rewarded by seeing the eschatological kingdom of God ushered in by Anglo-Jesus as they look lovingly at one another and to their amazement see the great city of God descend to the earth in the form of the proverbial image of the city on the hill. Accompanying the scene, as you saw, with the final words, liberty and union, and inseparable now and forever. The eschatology of birth gives us a window into how the dominant American culture views God. While God Talk at its best is a project that produces hope and perseverance in the midst of human-constructed evil and natural catastrophes and the finitude of life, it is also fundamentally a discourse on power. As a power discourse, it shapes the material world and allows for the powerful to attempt to escape the anxieties of individual death and the loss of cultural power. Theologian James Cone defines theology as, quote, subjective speech about God, a speech that tells us far more about the hopes and dreams of certain God talkers than about the maker and creator of heaven and earth, end quote. Applying Cone's definition of theology towards the eschatological picture displayed in birth, what emerges is a claim of whiteness over eternity that is designed to inform the temporal spatial order. Furthermore, the theological ideas that we see displayed within birth expresses the aspirations of not only those who created the film, but that of the nation itself. The ability to tell and sell a certain theological story that can live within a society, to structure the reality of that society, is tied within the nexus of theological imagination and material power. As a national story, birth provides us insight into the theological imagination of the American racial order. And what I want to offer is that Black disappearance is core to this theological project. Furthermore, eschatology, while in the hands of oppressors, remains a project deployed to evade their anxieties about death. Returning a bit to Cone, Dr. Cone states, instead of facing up to the reality of finite existence and the anxiety that accompanies it, they pretend that their eternality is dependent on their political, social, and economic dominance over the weak and helpless, close quote. This is exemplified in the Eschatology of Birth and the attempt by Griffith and Dixon to narrate the eternality of white rule predicated upon Black domination and expulsion. Black subjugation and white eternal life become intertwined with one another, as one cannot exist without the other. Cone's understanding of this sort of disoriented eternal orientation of a white eschatology is another iteration of when Du Bois says, whiteness as the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. Eschatology, as deployed by the ruling group of a society, can reproduce that ruling group's claim to power through sedimenting the excluded group status as eternally excluded. As a group identity formation, eschatology in the hands of American white Protestants was deployed to give them ownership of the temporal by way of the eternal. Are y'all following me? Yeah. I know I'm talking a lot. I'm kind of just going, you know, and I'm in my notes too, so I don't know if y'all are going like this like my son does, or if y'all are listening. He's been giving me thumbs down lately, so I don't know what that's about. All right. But to continue to talk about this aspect of eternal whiteness, and we're going to continue to unpack this. So this eternal instantiation of whiteness as depicted in Birth is expressed in what political theorist Barnard Hesse terms white sovereignty. For Hesse, white sovereignty is the, quote, historical assemblage of repeated colonial racial violence, end quote. Hesse identifies white sovereignty as having three modes of repeating forms of colonial violence that I think is helpful for us to think about today. Those forms are the founding violence expressed through the right to conquest, whiteness as a self-interpreting order, and reiterative violence, which is the permanent authority of whiteness. It is this last framework, the permanent authority of whiteness, that may be most aptly applied to the eschatology of Birth. Required to sediment the authority of whiteness is the process of repetition, the repetition of hierarchy, segregation, and normativity. The very point of the process of repetition is to repeat the colonial violence that birthed the nation as a tactic of normalization. A key example of this would be the ongoing and pervasive violence of police officers towards Black communities. As we can see this also with the execution of Marcellus Williams in Missouri, the violence and the brutality is the point. While Hesse's analysis is deployed to analyze what he terms racial policing and the limits of reform, the idea of repetition found in Birth is crafted through the surveying of police activities of the Klan. The role of the Klan in what has been called the racial revolution following slavery was to place in repetition the disposability of Black life through racial terror. As a religious movement, which Birth captures, this repetition is not bound to the temporal, but is the permanent repetition in the form of eternity. In the eschaton for Birth, Black life is repeatedly, eternally disappeared. White sovereignty, then, is not desired to be bound by the temporal order, but is eternal in its telos. Hesse's notion of the requirement of reiterative violence to instantiate white sovereignty opens up the eternal constitutive nature of violence within whiteness. The theological, while being an indispensable part of the conversation regarding analyzing Black disappearance through uncovering the eternal aspirations of whiteness, is not meant to distract us from this worldly materialization of white sovereignty. The reiterative violence of white sovereignty is entrenched in U.S. life through the ghettoization of Black communities, which are codified through exploitative economic practices and enforced through racialized policing and mass incarceration of Black persons. The Klan's disappearance of Black persons foreshadows the ways in which American police forces and juridical apparatus disappear Black persons within temporal space, in which the prison is one site. Whiteness cannot exist without violence, death, and destruction of the overdetermined other. The ability to facilitate the disappearance of a person, a place, or a thing is made possible through forms of power, whether natural or man-made. To disappear is the instance or fact of someone or something ceasing to be visible. That's just a Google definition. The sun, for instance, disappears at night from our vantage point due to the natural order of the universe. Disappearance is also, and to the point at hand, nefarious in orientation as someone going missing or being killed. Disappearance also communicates something ceasing to exist or a fading away. In each of these instances of disappearance, something or someone has disappeared due to violence or force, natural or human. Thus, the ability to eternally disappear requires an eternal mode of force, what Hesse has termed reiterative violence. This disappearance of Black people in the eschaton as a sign towards the eternal sedimentation of white sovereignty produced through repeatable genocidal acts. The restoration of Eden in birth is white sovereignty eternalized through Black disappearance. Malcolm X captures this and places this very bluntly when he says a white man's heaven is a Black man's hell, right? So let me pause for a second. Some of this is, coming out of my research. I want to say that some of the writing that I'm doing also really captures the mode of disappearance as articulated in late 19th century and early 20th century science writings and philosophy, where the idea was that Black persons were actually going to disappear from society based upon our supposed genetic inferiority, right? So this idea of disappearance that birth is capturing is drawing upon this larger ethos of ideas of Black disappearance during this historical time period, right? But let me kind of transition a little bit to thinking about how this applies to carceral space. So we do not see the actual space in which Black persons go at the conclusion of birth. The original script of the film depicted Black people going back to Africa in the film's conclusion, but that got scrapped. Yet absent from this visual ending, we can imply the space in which Black persons who are not permitted at the great banquet go. They go to hell, right? The idea of hell as an eternal or temporal destination has ramifications in geographic space and how we imagine the construction of our society and our relationships with one another. In the context of birth's filming and popularity, the groundwork for the carceral disappearance of Black persons was being laid, namely through the practice of convict leasing, right? And so here, just again, I'm not making the suggestion that birth produced the idea of Black disappearance, right? Or that birth produced the idea of carceral confinement of Black persons, but that the idea of disappearance that is articulated is lending itself to these other realities, right? Argentinian theologian Vitor Westphal in Plurality of the Eschaton. For Westphal, the eschaton is, as the discourse on endings or endings, it can entail different meanings deriving from the Greek noun eschatos or the plural eschaton. Thus, for Westphal, the eschaton should not be spoken of in the singular but in the plural. Westphal demonstrates that these multiple eschatological sites are created by human beings. They are limits, borders, and margins that are either set up by individuals, systems, or are by them suffered, while liberation represents the blessed crossing of them. Through foregrounding the spatial over the epochal, Westphal uncovers how eschatology lends itself to the systems of oppression and liberation within our midst. Rather than at the end of history, salvation and damnation are happening in our midst. And I want to offer that the prison is one site of this eschaton in our midst. Similarly to hell, as a part of the eschaton, carceral space uses time as a tool to punish human persons. As an instrument of punishment, time is deployed to mute the diversity of human experiences that occur from day to day and to distill them into an eternal now. Time slips as it stands still. Incarcerated authors describe the effects of time as use of punishment, particularly in the ways the outside world moves along while the carceral space is stagnant. Loved ones perish, they graduate from school, people get married, and time moves along. But the carceral space freezes time as a method of punishment. It's a space of frozen time outside of the world of time in which non-incarcerated persons make our lives. This frozen time is fundamentally marked by torture. Whether it is the Jim Crow practice of the chain gang, the ancient and contemporary practice of solitary confinement, the economic exploitation that prisoners endure in the prison industrial complex, and the overall ideas of non-contact torture that marks carceral punishment, time is deployed as a method of punishment. The prison emerges as an eschatological hope and space precisely because the hindrance and or destruction of Black communities provides identity formation and economic power for less vulnerable, mainly white American populations. By this, and there's more nuance to that, right? I mean, in terms of who is all working as correctional workers and all these kinds of things. By this, I mean the prison, through marking certain people as criminals and thus non-citizens, helps in the construction of who is actually an American citizen. Citizenry as a construct is fundamentally tied to ideas of religion and race, and in American life, non-white persons have always been seen as the non-citizen, the savage, or inhabiting an ill-formed notion of Christianity at best. The American political community, in justifying its mythology about itself, names vulnerable minoritized communities as the reason for their own vulnerability, tied to ideas of genetic inferiority, moral malformation, and savagery. All of these markers are markers of the non-rational, the ill-fit, the unsaved. And where do the unsaved go at the conclusion of history? The prison as a space of judgment is not simply a space for temporal punishment, but rather it is a symbol of eternal punishment, a space that houses the unsaved. Those that are marked as failing and fallen then enter carceral space as a socially constructed eschatological space. The prison becomes one site amongst a few which this eschatological disappearance of Black persons within a white supremacist imagination is made present. Y'all with me? Yeah. I got a little bit more to go. Bear with me. Y'all like, man, he talking too much. So the New York Times actually captures this disappearance of Black people from society in an April 2015 article titled 1.5 million missing Black men. And they state that, quote, perhaps the starkest description of the situation is this: more than 1 out of every 6 Black men who today should be between 25 and 54 years old have disappeared from daily life. The eschatological symbolism of Black disappearance and birth finds itself expressed in the social investment of the mass incarceration of Black persons, overwhelmingly which are Black men. And I want to note that Black women's incarceration rates have increased and continue to go up, as well as the work, Beth Ritchie's work, Arrested Justice, helps us to understand. This is the racial within racial eschatology, an eschatological vision that produces a social world that re-articulates its logics of racial dominance expressed in geographic space. The eschatological disappearance of Black persons as visualized in birth comes to represent this larger project of Black disappearance in our society. This religiously grounded disappearance of Black persons then is what I think about as a theo-racial architecture of Black disappearance. It's a mouthful. Let me say it again so I know what I'm talking about. Theo-racial architecture of Black disappearance. This architecture is the building by which racial eschatological faith that forms a social world and lends itself to the oppression of Black people is housed. This architecture is a framework to think about the shifts and changes in the ways Black people are disappeared in U.S. life. The emergence of mass incarceration as a site of disappearance in the 20th century as an outgrowth of the larger theologic of Black disappearance that is tethered to U.S. Christian symbolism and our political life. This architecture of Black disappearance targets Black persons in distinct ways, such as the enduring sedimentation of segregation, prison, and early death. The disappearance of Black persons into the prison within American life is an attack on our most economically and thus socially vulnerable, who are principally poor Black persons in America's over-policed communities. The theo-architecture of Black disappearance is the ground by which we can articulate Black disappearance across genres. Within the aspect of public policy, which has fueled the carceral state, a theoarchitecture of disappearance informs the political life of disappearance and policies that disappear Black persons from the public. As a conceptual framework, this architecture of disappearance points towards the ways in which theology, public policy, and anti-Black racism inform this disappearance of the Black body. For me, the theo is in reference to the eschatological. So for me, the theo is the eschatological in the way that I'm kind of thinking about how these things are connected. And as we have explored in Birth, the disappearance of Black persons from society is informed by Christian eschatological imagination. I want to offer that this idea of racial eschatological disappearance finds its major home in 20th century rapture theology. All right. And I'm writing my book, so I got some of this down that I'm thinking through, so help me as we get through it. Rather than the direct disappearance of Black persons as espoused in Birth, rapture theology articulates the disappearance of supposedly Orthodox evangelical Christians to be with Jesus. I want to offer that this period of rapture theology's deepening in American society in the latter part of the Cold War may not be by happenstance. But as an escapist theology, it was responding to the changing social terrain of U.S. life, namely civil rights and Black power movements, feminist and queer movements, and furthermore, the prison boom is emerging during the same late Cold War period and post-Cold War period, and becoming a space for the Black disappeared, a perverted rapture of sorts. Disappearance became the solution to social crises. Rapture for the evangelical Christian and disappearance for many poor Blacks, right? Disappearance into carceral spaces specifically. Within dispensationalism, disappearance is still a central mode by which society resolves its social conflicts. Rather than Black persons being directly disappeared as depicted in Birth, within dispensationalism, those that are raptured are faithful Christians, which function as a code for a diverse set of white persons that fall under the umbrella of whiteness. Dwight Moody, a major early proponent of dispensationalism, echoes the whiteness of the rapture, articulating heaven as more of a European polity with the exclusion of Black citizenry. Moody states that heaven won't only be inhabited by, quote, the Scotchman or the Englishman only, but also the Frenchman, the German, the Italian, and the Russian, a spectrum relegated to contemporary white ethnic identities, right? And you can find some of this right here from Daniel Hummel's The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, a newer text that just came out this year that's kind of charting this. And so Hummel, he describes the tenor of whiteness that undergirds this rapture theology that early proponents believed that the rapture would, quote, only take white people. This raptured group of white persons were seen as constituting a distinct race of people over and against the peoples of the world, a supra race that directs the affairs of the world to come on behalf of the Anglo Jesus. This idea of a supra race is an extension of the project of the white sovereign, who is destined, designed even, to rule the planet as a representation of the divine image. As such, dispensationalism can be seen as contributing to sedimenting racial assemblages of persons, as some being closer to the divine image and others being further in proximity or outside of it altogether. The project of race making is never disconnected from actualizing itself in the world. As a project of access and of subjugation, race and racism is, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to early death, to premature death. Therefore, the construction of a super race will inevitably create or reinforce segregation and subjugation within a society in which the super race holds power. Dispensationalism, as deepened in the life of American society by Cyrus Schofield, specifically, and white American evangelicals more broadly, like I mentioned John Hagee, Jack Van Impe, and many others, Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, there's a whole slew. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who watched TBN growing up. You know who I'm talking about, right? And so this is a part of the theological project of justifying white supremacy. Dispensationalism is a project that can be seen as an extension of arguments of white supremacy that justify its global presence. All right, how much time, how am I doing on time? I got like good 10 minutes, okay, cool, all right. I got a little more I want to talk to y'all about. So, because I got to get to some Tupac stuff too. Yeah, we should talk about Pac, because Pac sort of challenges these things. Right, so while having some distinction, rapture theology articulates similar logic as the eschatology espoused in Birth, in that white persons are seen as those who are destined to rule in eternity. Both eschatologies use disappearance as a solution to navigate the changing racial social terrain of American life post-Reconstruction and post the Civil Rights and Black Power movements. Where Birth identifies Black persons as those needing to be disappeared, rapture theology maybe inverts this disappearance. It is the righteous white race that will be raptured to be with Jesus to rule the world, and the dark hordes of the planet will be left behind. While these two modes of disappearance may appear to be distinct, disappearance is still the theological response to the shifts in society that white persons deemed evil in the sight of God. Whether it's a white or a Black person that are disappeared, the solution is not the enhancement of human concern, but the removal of the Black enemy from the social field of vision. Now, Pac, let's talk a little bit about Tupac, because you're like, well, how does Tupac fit into this? Tupac is, a fundamentally brilliant thinker. I think that he's one of the most brilliant thinkers of the 20th century, not just in his music, but in his interviews and his artistic performance, and how he understood the situation of race, class, and religion in the United States. And so I didn't want to put a whole bunch of extra stuff at the end of this, but we can maybe talk a little bit more about him in some Q&A. But I want to sort of think about Tupac's last album, the Don Illuminati, the 7-Day Theory, under the pseudonym Machiavelli, where he's on the cover on the cross. He's crucified on the cross with all of the names of the cities in which Black people primarily, or there's dense Black populations in American life, kind of etched into the cross. So representing himself as a symbol of Black existence in the United States. So I believe that the artist Tupac Shakur captures this problem of dispensationalism as a racial eschatology tied to Black disappearance into cultural spaces, pretty pointedly. All right. So on his posthumously released album, The Don Illuminati, The 7-Day Theory, released under the pseudonym Machiavelli, in his album, Shakur reorients listeners away from the idea of hell existing at the conclusion of human history, but rather hell existing in the here and now, mainly for Shakur in the state-sanctioned death space of the prison. But specifically, I want to bring attention to Shakur's critique of dispensationalism on the aptly titled track, Blasphemy. The beginning of the song is the outro of the popular 1980s and 1990s television radio program, This Week in Bible Prophecy. I know y'all watch This Week in Prophecy. Was produced by Paul and Peter Lalonde, biological brothers who were Canadian-American film producers, film writers, and co-founder of the film company Cloud 10 Pictures. The show was a popular 1980s biblical series that reaffirmed the dispensational eschatological framework for its viewers. The Lalonde brothers also co-produced the Left Behind film in 2014, as well as other end-time novels such as 2000 AD, Are You Ready? And 301 Startling Proofs and Prophecies, and films such as Tribulation in 2000, Revelation in 2008, and Apocalypse in 1998. So you can see they made a lot of money selling people this particular story. The actual outro to the show is as follows, quote, God has a plan, and the Bible unfolds that wonderful plan through the message of prophecy. God sent Jesus into this world to be our Savior, and that Christ is returning someday soon to unfold the wonderful plan of eternity for my life and your life, as long as we are cooperating with God by accepting Jesus Christ as our personal Lord and Savior. And as the Lord does return in the coming 7 days, we'll see you next time here on This Week in Bible Prophecy. Man, I got to give it to them. Their grift was real. Yeah. Their hustle was, yeah. We'll see you next time. Tune in. Right? So, yeah. Yeah, man, that's comedy, right? And so, this show is, centered the eschatology viewpoint of dispensationalism, right? So Tupac, at the beginning of his song Blasphemy, he places this outro at the beginning as the introduction to his song, right? So he can set up a way of how the dominant form of religion is functioning so that he can blaspheme it, right? So that he can unsettle it, move alongside of it, and dispense of it as he sort of thinks about how this religious imagery and language is tied to Black suffering, right? And so at the conclusion of the outro of the popular radio and television program, we hear now I'm back to the song and blasphemy, we hear Tupac in reference to himself say, "Tupac, don't start that blasphemy in here." Tupac then begins to critique dominant forms of Anglo-Christianity that he sees as tied to the structuring of the death worlds that the Black poor find themselves. Rather than the fear of being left behind during the event of the rapture, Shakur highlights that Black communities have already been left behind. Shakur exposes rapture theology for its racial performance and its escapism. Through his lyrical onslaught, he challenges what he perceives to be dominant theological orthodoxies that undergird Blackness as left behind. This is what he calls blasphemy, and he offers Black solidarity as a direct challenge to the quest of leaving Black persons behind. Other themes that Shakur is exploring on blasphemy that he is unsettling alongside dispensationalism are male imageries of God, the belief in miracles without seeing miracles within our everyday midst, and again, the idea that hell is at the conclusion of history, or rather than hell being existing in our current midst. He says pretty pointedly, excuse my language, I'm gonna have to curse just a little bit, is quoting a rap song. He says, "We're probably in hell already, our dumb asses not knowing. Everybody's kissing ass to go to heaven, they ain't going. I put my soul on it, right? I'm fighting devils daily, plus the media is crucifying brothers severely," right? And so he's doing deep theological work on this song. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know the politics. I don't know if I could play it for you. You know, so we're going to just play it for you and kind of vibe out to it, right? So Shakur, on his title Blasphemy, is very intentional that he is sort of structuring this song alongside of a critique of dispensationalism. So rather than Blackness disappeared and hidden, Shakur wants his viewers to see Blackness on full display on the breadth of this album. But the suffering that Black persons have experienced in American life, as well as the resilience and determination these communities have exhibited, right? Visually, Shakur places himself in a crucifix on the album cover. On Shakur's cross is a map of the central cities in which Black people make their lives in the United States. The intentionality of this visual representation of Shakur should not be divorced from the religious ethos that he is challenging, a Christian theology that seeks to turn from the Black suffering that it has enabled and structured into the modern world. One that promotes a fear of being left behind, all the while not addressing or taking accountability for those that are disappeared and left behind in our very midst. And again, for Shakur and his corpus, that left behind spaces fundamentally constitute ghettoized environments and carceral spaces for Shakur. In conclusion, because I hope I haven't meandered too much, the point of what I'm offering to us this evening is that what we imagine as our eschatological future has a direct impact on the type of world that we are forming in the present. And let us deploy that imagination towards the restoration of the earth and human relationships, and have faith enough in the possibilities of our collective futures together. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. So we have time and we have lots to talk about. So questions, comments, we have a microphone that we will bring to you so that everyone can hear. And I'll let Dr. White field his own questions.
I'm coming.
Please. And can you share your name before you speak?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Laura Kelly. I'm Director of Annual Giving here at LPTS. Thank you so much. I kind of have two questions, and maybe you could answer both or neither, whichever. So one question that I have is, what do you make of the so post-incarceral engineered recidivism, right, that we see coming out of so much of particularly private, for-profit prison industrial towns and cities. What do you make of the voter disenfranchisement that accompanies engineered recidivism, especially at the inflection point we're at with the election, especially with the candidate we have who's a prosecutor, a woman of color? I think there's just a really interesting national conversation happening there. And then the other question that I have is, what do you make of calls for prison abolition and the kind of movement away from, or the movement towards rehabilitation? I'm a Quaker. I come from a Quaker context. James Logan, who's a theologian who wrote Good Punishment.
That's a great book.
He was my professor in undergrad.
He's
I
not
wrote.
an abolitionist
Yeah,
either.
he is not. He is not, and he'll tell you're not either. By the way, I wrote. Yeah. So what do you? If any of those are questions that that came through.
Yeah, I sat
and
with,
thank you.
with Dr. Logan. I wonder if we remember this conversation at AAR, and he was explaining to me why he's not an
Yeah.
abolitionist. I felt him, So I've grown to fall more in line in the abolitionist position personally, and the reason for that is because the way that I understand mass incarceration as a system is that it is an outgrowth of the American project of racial dominance towards Black persons. And so to build up a prison system constituting those who have been explicitly targeted and subjected doesn't make sense to me, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think accountability shouldn't take place or the removal of communities in some form or fashion should not happen. But the prison system, the state-sanctioned prison system as producing that can only turn out negative. It can only produce what we've essentially seen, right? But to be fair to the conversation about abolition is that conversation from formerly incarcerated and incarcerated persons varies, right? They don't all have the position of abolish the prison either. So it is, there's a lot of nuance there that I'm still learning in that instance. But I would say that I think that the first question, if I'm hearing you correctly about voting and citizenship, is, I think I might have touched on it just briefly, is that the prison in disenfranchising those who are within its walls, while at the same time benefiting from them economically, is a part of this whole process of marking communities as the non-citizen and not participating, being able to participate within the democratic process or within our economic systems, right? And I think there's a chapter in there's an idea that I'm still looking to deepen in when I'm writing about that, but I have a little catchy phrase work that I'm trying to work through, because I think I'm trying to capture this connection that you're laying out. And particularly as we tie it to eschatology, I'm really interested in exploring something I'm thinking about called rapture capitalism, this idea of the sudden disappearance of people and the sudden disappearance of economic resources out of our community, and how that happens at this very moment of late capitalism's victory over communism in the 1980s and the 1990s. I think all of these things are speaking to each other. The blowing up of dispensationalism, the end of the Cold War, the prison boom, the increase in 1980s gang conflict in cities based on the U.S. government bringing in cocaine and things like that into the United States, or the CIA all these things are speaking to one another for me. And so I think this, to your point about these sort of prison boom kind of towns, if you will, if I can kind of add that to what you're saying, is tied still to me within an eschatological kind of way. But I'm still working. Yeah. You can mark it up and disagree with me too.
Yes, I'm Marcus Hong. I serve as the Director of Lifelong Learning here. Thank you so much I wrote pages of notes. I was struck, I was listening to a report today about Emmanuel Littlejohn, who was killed in Oklahoma, death by lethal injection today, in a case that was from 1992. He died having been wheelchair bound, and the clemency board voted to say he should be given clemency. The governor didn't grant it. But what I was struck by as you were talking was they were interviewing him and his spiritual advisor, and his spiritual advisor's hope was that he would receive life in prison instead of death by lethal injection. And I just thought the sort of twisted way that death sentence makes the hell of life in prison seem like a hope. Right? As you were talking, I was like, oh, I didn't know why it disturbed me this morning. And then as you talked, I was like, oh, that's why it's disturbing me. So I'm sort of talking the other end of what Laura's bringing up, right? About, so the death sentence being used as something that makes this other thing seem palatable or, or hopeful, eschatological. I don't know. So I don't know what your thoughts about the death sentence are in relation to your work.
Wow, yeah, that's really good. Thank you. Yeah, to be honest, I haven't thought too much about the death penalty in my work thus far. Most of my work, as I think about carceral space, is more of the non-contact torture that's exhibited in the space, right? I mean, on a personal note, I don't believe in the death penalty, at least being sanctioned by the state. I wish I could say from a moral standpoint that I'm against it, but I don't think that's really my position. It's really that I just don't think that human beings in government that governments are capable of dispensing with it in a fair kind of way. But I haven't really thought I haven't thought that deeply about death penalty in my work. Yeah, but it is the ultimate disappearance. Right. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, that's why I'm preaching, because it is the ultimate disappearance. You're exactly right, which is a part of and so what happened in Missouri with the brother who was just executed, it puts that right back on clear and full display. But it is the ultimate disappearance. Yeah, so you're right, I do need to think more about it.
Thank you. My name is Alison Mejores, and I am a minister, but also a recording artist and a producer and a film composer. So watching the birth of the nation, I heard the European classical music, and it was invoking this angelic type of music to make the audience feel to confirm that this is right. And then the juxtaposition between European classical music and African American classical music, which is Tupac, and how hip hop and classical music is always in opposition. And so, sometimes as hip hop artists, we sample that to blaspheme it, basically, and to say what we want to say. What is our liberation? What is our classical? What is our, all of those things. So for you to put Tupac at the end makes sense, because you started with a medium of sound and vision, and then ending with a medium of sound, and then you're talking about the actual visual of it. So I just wanted to make that comment. Yeah. What is your thoughts on artists, because he's a political activist, but what do you think would be an advice for a artist who wants to make a stand using your, capitalistic rapture? Is that what you said?
Rapture capitalism.
Okay. It's in there.
We got to get into the studio or something.
We will. And I'm in the process of creating a film and kind of touching on that disappearance, but in a Afrofuturistic type of manner. Yeah. It's gonna be done. So I'm just from your perspective as a minister, a theologian, and then how to direct somebody into conveying all of that,
Yeah, I feel like I can't give you that.
Okay. I'm just saying.
Honestly, I feel like you can give me that because you're the artist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're the one who can do, but I can't do both. I can maybe write or say some things, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But you can write, say some things, and cast it in a creative way that actually reaches beyond, a bunch of nerds in a room or online. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So I feel like I need to take, I'd say that happily, that I'm one of you all in that way. Yeah. So I think I would learn more from you in that space. What I would say though, what I'm curious about is your Afrofuturism piece, because because I'm kind of what I'm wrestling with is how to sort of conclude the manuscript, And one of the things that is poking my spirit is thinking about Afrofuturism and disappearance. But I'm also thinking about Soon Ra's Space is the Place, right? And sort of how to juxtapose how within a Christian imagination, Black people are disappeared, but what does it mean when Black people self-disappear and think about disappearing? You know what I'm saying? And
their own liberation.
in our own, so yeah.
And then you were talking about how instead of choosing disappearance as a solution, why don't we just help the people here have the faith that liberation can be here and now instead of separation? And that's where Afrofuturism is thinking, how can we innovate? Or how can we go to another planet?
Yeah.
For real.
That's right,
That's not working.
Yeah, that's right, that's what Afrofuturism
How
is.
can we do that? So we're gonna talk.
Yeah, no, that's real, nice, thank you, yeah.
We have a question from one of our virtual
I hope
participants.
it's my mama, let's see.
Bonnie Carnizaro from Pueblo, Colorado. A related question. Several people claiming to be Christians today are saying that true believers need not become environmentally aware or do anything to address climate change because the apocalypse is imminent.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, dispensationalism helped, helped craft a generation's thinking around, I'm talking like this, Bonnie's over here, sorry. Dispensationalism helped craft, a generation's thinking that we don't have responsibilities to the earth. Now, my work isn't specifically about climate justice, but if we're going to be raptured, then taking care of the earth doesn't matter. You can frack in the soil, you can pollute the rivers and the seas because we're not going to be here anyways. And so those things are definitely paired one with another.
I think I have a quick question. Amina McIntyre, long title. But essentially, I am an artist and a scholar. And so you can do both, but I get it. But I did want to bring up and ask the question around, you mentioned about white Christian imagination. So can you also talk a little bit, or if you've started to explore where Black imagination has also encountered rapture and eschatology? Because of course, you can talk about any speeches, any, if you look at like enslaved narratives, if you look at also even the one real funky movie that Avery Brooks was a part of, gotta remember the name of it, but it was a bunch of shorts, and essentially the aliens asked for all the Black folks to come forward, and all the Black folks got like kind of pulled up into the spaceship, and they also were like, they were whitening their skin and things of that nature. So there's kind of a line where Black imagination has already kind of started entertaining some of this, in addition to also what it looks like to resist. And so can you maybe talk about where Black imagination has gone in some of this space?
Yeah, I'm not sure about like Black rapture and slave narratives. I actually would be very interested in hearing and learning more about that piece. As you're talking, what comes into mind is you're naming a different episode, but I was thinking Derek Bell's Space Traders, right? This kind of this idea of Black folks being raptured by an alien race, but it was again this sort of like removal at the hands of a powerful entity rather than sort of their own on their own volition, right? And so I think in my particular interest in this iteration is how we're being sort of more the forced removal that we're actually experiencing. And I think for me, Shakur helps me to kind of think about how despite that these forced removals, that we actually can be in solidarity and grounded in the here and now. And so, so I look more like in the hip hop space of what that grounding looks like, but it's not really like a Black rapture kind of space.
I have one over here, and then I'll come up there.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Raymond Meester, our daughter, went to the seminary. Your comment about Woodrow Wilson showing this in the White House, and I just saw that his father was a professor at another Presbyterian seminary, and that Woodrow was a lifelong Presbyterian. In your research, have you seen anything interesting in that relation, that family or?
No, to be honest, Woodrow Wilson is like a side note in the story for me. It's weird. He's like a side note and important, but not where I'm going to go down a rabbit hole with him. But just more, I think he's important just by nature of his position and where he showed the film and how he was actually connected to Thomas Dixon, right? So Dixon and Wilson actually went to Johns Hopkins together at one point. So when the film was actually there was, NAACP was making moves against the film, hearing that it was coming out, and they were trying to stop the film. Thomas Dixon actually went to Wilson, his old classmate, to garner the support that he needed for it to come out. So Wilson, not only did he say it's like history and enlightening, that was deployed as a purpose of getting the film out and about into the world. So he did have social investments in that way. But that's probably like the extent that I've really kind of read on Wilson personally. I don't know much about like his particular theological leanings prior to that. Yeah, I know kind of offhand, I know he did write a book like in the late 1800s that was like extremely racist around its belief around Black persons that D.W. Griffith was actually drawing upon in part for the film Birth of a Nation as well. Yeah, but I don't know much about his theology. I think we had a sister.
Hi, Krisha Arvin, manager of CPE at Norton. So I gotta say, I have never ever thought of the rapture as essentially great white flight. And as you put it that way, I thought, what? Did that just happen? Great white, okay. I hadn't noticed it in that way. And then the sister's question back here was kind of percolating in the back of my mind as I thought of my grandmother and all that she taught. And so my grandmother is Black, African American. I just want to make sure you knew that for the people at home. But anyway, so when my grandmother would talk about, the Lord is coming back, He's going to take us. We are the believers. It sounded as though this was going to be the place where her worries would end, ours would end. Her sweet granddaughter wouldn't have to worry about a world that was like the one she lived in. And so, eschatology and all of the ways in which it influences Black thought in some of the more rural places, like where I grew up. So I guess, aside from that comment, I'm trying to understand how do you reconcile the scores and numbers of Black Americans who are hopeful for that rapture? And they see themselves taken up. So they're not going anywhere where we're not going to be.
I think
in other words.
That's a great question. And some of the ways that because me too, my family, believed in the rapture, right? My grandpa was a pastor for 45 years. He didn't harp on it so much in the pulpit, but that was his belief that we're going to be raptured. And so a part of the belief, from my understanding of Black eschatological viewpoints, is that our sort of rootedness and belief in the rapture isn't sort of for the purpose of dominating others or sort of forming a social world in which we're on top of. It's a relief from the sort of demonic powers of the world, right? And I think that's a different kind of perspective as to orientation, as to why I think that's a different kind of motivation, right? I think being motivated to flee deeply bound oppression is a different sort of motivation of desiring disappearance than, Black folks got their freedom, queer folks can get married, women can go to work. And so in that sense, society has fallen apart. For me, I think those two sort of orientations are different. And so, so I don't know if like this is a solid enough sort of answer, but to be honest, I'm not really like interested in critiquing Black folks' belief in the rapture just by nature of believing that it's more connected to the deep desire of fleeing oppression when there is no other kind of option or outcome, right? And so I don't see the two things as the same, right? Now I think some could, push back and be critical in a way of saying, well, those who are responding, and by those meaning Anglo-Protestants, who are responding to these social changes see these things as oppressive. And so how are you delineating between those kinds of oppressions in that kind of way, right? But from my vantage, I mean, just to be honest, just those things aren't oppressive and these other things are, you know what I mean? And so, so I don't see those two orientations being similar. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and I have more to think about.
So will you help me thank our lecturer for being with us this evening? So thank you so much for coming out this evening, and you are welcome to join us again for our next lecture series that will be coming up soon. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you. Yes.